Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Ewalt. I serve the Texas Tribune as Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism. Welcome to those joining us here in person in Austin and those joining us online for our conversation today previewing the 2024 election. Our panel today includes Texas Tribune democracy reporter Rob Downen, Renzo Downey, lead writer of The Blast, the Tribune's premium politics newsletter, and Tribune politics reporter Jasper Scherer. Our moderator is Texas Tribune politics editor Rebekah Allen. Our program will run an hour, with 45 minutes for conversation and 15 minutes or so for your questions. Here in Austin, we have a mic for our in-person audience right over there, and our virtual audience can also submit questions online at our Q&A portal. That's at texastribune.org/ask. We're grateful for the support of our sponsors today. Our presenting sponsor is HAR.com. And our major sponsor is Home Slice Pizza. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. Also thank those all around the state who make the journalism of the Tribune, and including events like this, possible by becoming Texas Tribune members. To learn more and to become a member, visit texastribune.org/support. We do have a few upcoming Texas Tribune events that I'd like to note. Join us at 9 a.m. next Thursday, November 7th, for our post-election event, Breaking Down the 2024 Election, when we'll break down the results and discuss what it all means for Texas. And on November 13th and 14th in San Antonio, we'll gather for Small Towns, Big Possibilities, Our Future of Rural Symposium. We'll convene ranchers and farmers, elected officials, and civic leaders from every corner of Texas to talk about where rural Texas is today and where it can go next. And lastly, on November 19th, we'll be in San Antonio for our Inside the Interim conversation with San Antonio lawmakers about priorities for the 2025 Texas Legislature. You can learn about all of these events and more at texastribune.org/events. So now let's get to know our panel. Rob Downen is a reporter covering democracy and the threats to it, including extremism, disinformation, and conspiracies. Before joining the Tribune in 2022, he worked for 5 years at the Houston Chronicle. Renzo Downey is the lead writer of The Blast. Prior to joining the Tribune in February 2023, he worked as a state government and politics reporter and a newsletter editor for Florida Politics. Jasper Scherer is a politics reporter for the Tribune. He previously covered Texas politics and government for Hearst Newspaper's Austin Bureau, where he joined after stints covering City Hall for the Houston Chronicle and Bexar County for the San Antonio Express News. And our moderator, Rebekah Allen, is the politics editor for the Tribune, where she previously served as news editor. And before joining the Tribune, she worked as a State House reporter for the Dallas Morning News. I thank our panel and our audience for being here in Austin and around the state this morning. And with that, I turn the program over to Rebekah.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning and welcome to the Texas Tribune. We are 1 week out, which feels pretty extraordinary because over here we've been talking and thinking about it for, I don't know, more than a year, probably since the last election. So we're here to talk about what we've been watching in some of these races. This team of reporters here have been on the ground watching these candidates, these races, these issues and fights that are going to be defining a lot of the elections. I don't have to tell you guys that it's been an absolutely phenomenal, unprecedented election cycle nationally, with President Biden stepping down from the top of the ticket and Vice President Kamala Harris's historic nomination and assassination attempts on former President Donald Trump. All of that has a trickle-down effect into some of the races that we are seeing here in Texas. It is animating these races. It is changing the landscape of Texas's races. And likewise, Texas's races are going to have a major impact on national politics, as well as just your everyday lives here in Texas. So we're going to get into some of these races and leave some space for you guys to ask some questions. So let's talk first about this notion, every single election cycle, that Texas might turn blue. Every cycle, we see the same sort of breathless national reporting about this idea that Texas turns blue, and I think we in the office are a little bit more skeptical. I think for me personally, I start the season like ardently opposed to the idea, and then by this time, I'm kind of like, I wonder if they have a point. So let's kind of talk a little bit about what you guys are seeing. Jasper, you were just in Houston on Friday at the Harris event. On Friday, we had both
The Beyonce event.
the Beyonce event. So true. We had both presidential candidates here with 11 days out. I'm just curious, what were they doing here?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, if you look at this through the lens of is Texas turning blue at the presidential level, I think both of those visits were less a reflection of the two candidates actually pursuing the state's 40 electoral college votes, and more, they kind of had their own business. I think Trump, of course, was here for the Joe Rogan podcast taping, and just sort of happened to show up or rather invite Ted Cruz to his event, kind of, I think, nominally acknowledged him there. And, on the other hand, with Kamala Harris coming here, I think it was sort of a combination of just spotlighting, Texas being ground zero in the abortion conversation. I think she's really, trying to also just get out of the cycle of, jumping around between Pennsylvania to Michigan to, just kind of shake things up and refocus everyone's attention on the Texas abortion ban in the closing months or the closing weeks of the campaign. Additionally, I think Colin Allred in his Senate race, if he wins, then there's a good chance Kamala Harris, if she wins the presidency, that she would have a Democratic majority in the Senate. Without an Allred victory, she's looking at a tough road in Congress. So I think it was kind of a combination of those factors more than anything else.
Well, let's play this out a little bit. If you're a Democrat nationally, or if you're a Democrat strategist in Texas, what are like the pieces of evidence that you're looking at when you're trying to sell people on this notion that like national Democrats should be investing in Texas because it is flippable, or just generally this idea that this could be the year?
Yeah, you're kind of looking at the combination of polling that we've seen in the Senate race over the last couple months or so. Really since Biden dropped out of the race, and there was sort of that surge of enthusiasm, momentum with folks, kind of just Democrats suddenly seeing that they had a chance. Nationally, I think that trickled down to the Texas Senate race too. Just the kind of with Biden atop the ticket, there was sort of a sense of hopelessness, I think, with Democrats, and just so looking at those recent polls and kind of the surge of donations to Allred's campaign, he's already surpassed the record that Beto O'Rourke's set back in 2018. So just sort of looking at those top line factors, but I think it's also kind of a tough sell because we're just for Democrats, that is, because we're just coming out of a redistricting cycle that's still it's still pretty close in the rearview mirror. So a lot of these districts are they haven't had time to sort of see the demographic change that we saw back in 2018 made those districts more competitive. It's so I guess to answer your question, I think it is a tough sell because there are also a lot of factors working against Democrats right now, especially with Harris not really pumping money into actually contesting the state.
Yeah, Renzo, I'm curious if you have any other thoughts, like on the opposite side of that, like what is like encouraging Republicans in terms of their messaging that like that Texas is safely a red state.
Yeah, well, I think that in the years of Donald Trump, you've seen the Hispanic vote start moving more towards the Republicans, and that's kind of playing out in the Rio Grande Valley, and you're seeing those races get more competitive. You're seeing at the state level a lot of investment. At the state legislative level, you're seeing more investment down in those races, and I think you also need to look at what's happening in Houston and the suburbs as well.
Yeah. And if you just look at the polling, it's closer for the Senate race, right? Like there's a few polls that have showed that within like the margin of error, but Trump has generally been polling pretty safely in Texas. And let's not forget that it's the last Democrat that Texas went for was Jimmy Carter. So there's a lot against, working against.
Yeah, I think, and it's also important to look just historically, it's extremely rare for a Senate candidate to kind of defy what happens at the top of to win a state that their presidential nominee loses. So and that's what makes things so hard for Colin Allred this cycle is just with Harris, if she contested the state and even if she lost by a couple percentage points, that puts it, it just lightens the load on Allred significantly. But if the polls are correct and Trump is in a week is headed towards a 5 to 7 point win, say in Texas, which would be relatively in line with what we saw in 2020. That's asking a lot from Allred to kind of suss out these mysterious Trump Allred voters that the polls seem to be suggesting do exist, but it's just a matter of how many there are out there. And if we remember in 2020, John Cornyn was on the ballot and ended up being the opposite, where Trump won the state by about 5.5 points, and Cornyn won in a blowout. So Allred's trying to kind of defy gravity and do the opposite of that.
I am mystified by the idea of a Trump Allred voter.
If you're out there, we'd love to talk to you.
Yes, please raise your hand. Okay, let's talk about in the event of a Trump administration. We have seen over the past few years lots of Texans in office really ingratiate themselves to former President Trump, and we can expect that. And we've seen some of them help, sort of form the policy and influence the policy around that campaign. I'm curious, Rob, can you talk a little bit about just what you expect if Trump was to be reelected, how that would affect who we could see from Texas, maybe joining that campaign?
I think, there have been rumors out there for a while, but I guess whether Paxton would be in someone who would be under consideration. I think from a non-administration standpoint, Trump's vows to crack down on immigration would obviously have a huge impact in Texas, and I'm sure would really thrust Governor Abbott even more so into the national spotlight on that conversation. You have people like Sid Miller, who is spent the last few months riding around the country on a bus. I think it's called the Gas and Groceries Tour, and he is going from swing district to swing district, kind of as a surrogate for the Trump campaign. I've talked to him about he I think is highly in consideration for potentially leading the Department of Agriculture, and I've talked to him, somewhat lengthily about that, and I think he's definitely interested. Then you have, people like Tim Dunn, who, far-right mega donor from West Texas, who obviously has helped reshape our politics here, but has really taken a lot more of a national interest in the last few years, particularly now that he's got even more money and time after selling his selling his company. So I think that, his policies and his people, him and Brad Parscale, who is Trump's former digital campaign manager and campaign manager, have really become like this over the past few years and are working together on a lot of different projects. So I would, kind of think that Tim Dunn, who sits on the board at TPPF, Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is kind of, has a lot of the Venn diagram between them and Heritage and, some of the Project 2025 folks. I think it's somewhat apparent. So I would kind of assume that, the Tim Dunn world and worldview may kind of be playing out a little bit more at a national level. So,
yeah, and also there's Brooke Rollins, who kind of comes out of that TPPF ecosystem, used to lead the organization. She's already served in some capacity in past Trump administration and is reportedly in line to be potentially chief of staff, or at least is on the short list in a possible Trump administration. Her mother also is incidentally running for a state house seat, so it's kind of just would further the ties, I think, between Texas's top folks and the Trump administration if she ends up being chief of staff.
And just sort of going in the other direction, I mean, how have we seen some of like Texas's sort of like Republican policy, like think tank leaders, sort of influence, Trump's campaign policy? I mean, you wrote a story. Was it maybe earlier this year about David Barton? Like that one, that's like an example that comes to mind. Can you talk a little bit about some of that?
Would I like to talk about David Barton? Always. So David Barton is a pastor in North Texas, self-proclaimed amateur historian. And anytime you hear somebody talking about it, it's become more common amongst Republican circles these days. But this idea that church-state separation is a myth, that is his idea. He spent the last 40-ish years kind of barnstorming the country and legislatures across the country, making the argument that we were actually founded as a Judeo-Christian country, and that the church or separation of church and state has been intentionally used to obscure those roots, and that, in his view, the founding fathers, and these are claims that have been widely debunked by actual historians, yes, and in his view, the Establishment Clause was only meant to prohibit the establishment of a Christian denomination rather than flourish religious pluralism. And so his views have really become, very mainstream in Republican circles in Texas. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has kind of used some of his claims. We saw he was at the legislature last year testifying in favor of, I believe, the Ten Commandments bill, and in one hearing there were, I think, 3 senators who kind of used some of his lines as well. And his views have really taken hold nationally. Mike Johnson is a speaker, U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson is a Bartonite and are very close, and he is kind of, I think, really seeing the fruition of 40 decades of his work kind of coming into, I guess, the mainstream. So,
let's talk about the Senate race again. So let's talk about Colin Allred and sort of like the elephant in the room, or the donkey in the room, which is Beto O'Rourke. And we reported a lot this year about sort of how he has charted a path to really differentiate himself from Beto. He's angling to be more moderate. He's focusing on ads instead of retail politics. Jasper, I'm curious, do you think that that's worked out for him?
Well, I think that strategy at the sort of earlier in the cycle, before folks were, paying a whole lot of attention, before we started, seeing serious polling and all the fundraising numbers come in, I think that strategy was getting pretty roundly criticized. And to Allred's credit, I mean, I think you could say it's working, just in the sense that, this is a competitive race. We are talking about this race a week out. His fundraising has, far from drying up from, I think there was some concern about, is this guy really running a serious race? Fast forward to right now, it clearly has borne some fruit. Whether there's mathematically enough of those folks, those voters we were just talking about earlier, the kind of Trump Allred voters, or maybe the voters who are, I don't know, like skipping the presidential race and just kind of voting down ballot, or casting a protest vote. Like, I think those are kind of the folks that he's angling for. But also, we've seen him with this event with Beyonce, and just he's out campaigning with Raphael Warnock from Georgia today, sort of trying to. It seems like he's almost shifting towards more of a base mobilization strategy in these closing days, almost as if he's feels that he's tapped out, as many of those moderates as he can, and just like, so, I think it is working, in the sense that he's also sort of letting his opponent Ted Cruz kind of, speak for himself. He knows who he's running against, and he's kind of trying to, if he was running against John Cornyn, I don't think the strategy would work. So it's clear that he's been kind of deliberate and laser focused on that strategy, and I would say it has worked. Yeah.
I think that there's one similarity between the Beto campaign and the Allred campaign that people kind of gloss over, and that's that they kind of shared a similar strategy in being Texas focused in their race. People think about the national attention that Beto got, but that kind of really came on later in the campaign. Earlier on, he was saying that this is a Texas race. I'm don't want the national folks getting involved, and that's kind of the path that Allred had been cutting for the last several months, and it's really been these last few weeks. Maybe you could say since being on the main stage of the convention that he's kind of embraced the national spotlight a little bit more.
How much of that do you guys think is their strategy or people not thinking that they have a chance?
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely a little bit of that too. Just with the with it, sort of the floodgates have opened once the national Democrats, Chuck Schumer's political group, and just sort of the DC-based Democratic super PACs have definitely come in sort of in a row, I guess, towards the end here. So I think it is definitely a matter, I think, of smelling some blood in the water too.
I was just going to add that also nationally, when Chuck Schumer's thinking about his Democratic coalition, he's probably losing John Tester. Ohio's a fight. Florida would be the next spot. Of all those places, Ohio and Texas seem like the most competitive. And so I think that's why you're in this cycle really seeing the Democrats come late here in Texas.
Including why you probably saw Kamala Harris actually spending her valuable time in the closing days here, coming down to rally with Colin Allred. Yeah.
Right, and that's such an interesting dynamic, and we've been reporting about this, how the two need each other, but Allred's strategy has been to kind of hold her at at arm's reach for the majority of his campaign. And I was thinking about that this week. We've talked about this, but he is similar to Kamala Harris in that he hasn't really spent the majority of his campaign talking about the historic nature of his own candidacy. If he were he would become Texas's first Black senator. I actually heard, was it maybe last week, him say that in an ad for the first, what to me seemed like the first time. Does it seem like he's sort of leaning into this, the fact that he would be the first Black senator and kind of reaching out for Harris more to get Black voters?
Yeah, I think unquestionably in these last few days, just mentioned that event with Raphael Warnock. I believe it's at Texas Southern University, one of the biggest HBCUs in the country. The rally he did with Beyonce unquestionably was appealed to Black voters in Houston and around the state. I mean, I think there was at one point one of the speakers, or maybe it was the DJ or MC at the event, asked the crowd, how many of you guys are HBCU graduates? And there was this gigantic, roar from the crowd. So I think it's clear that, and just statistically looking at how much untapped, I guess, potential there is for Democratic candidates to make a concerted effort to get Black voters to turn out. There are over 3 million. It's either eligible or registered voters, Black voters in Texas. It's the most reliable, portion of the Democratic base. So and we have seen Allred. I think we should note that he hasn't been doing as much retail campaigning as we saw from Beto O'Rourke, but he has spent quite a bit of time going to Black Baptist churches in some of the big cities like Houston, Dallas when he does visit. So I think that shouldn't be glossed over either.
I did think it was interesting because they were billed at this big Houston rally with Beyonce together. There is no photographic evidence of the two standing next to each other, and I think I wonder if that's not strategic so that Republicans can't do mailers of the two, because that does seem like a very important campaign strategy for Ted Cruz, right? Renzo, can you talk a little bit about what Cruz's strategy has been here?
Yeah, well, Cruz has been first of all trying to tie Allred to Harris. You've seen him also talk about Allred and Nancy Pelosi, because Allred, of course, is a congressman and has been serving since 2018, right? And You've also seen them fight over bipartisanship, trying to portray themselves as the better negotiator. Just yesterday, Ted Cruz had a op-ed in the Dallas Morning News. It was kind of this more nuanced approach at the CHIPS Act that the original CHIPS Act, he voted against. And he says that that was because it was, portions of it were more of a government handout, and that's what Allred has been hitting him on partially regarding infrastructure and bipartisanship. And you've also seen Ted Cruz lean pretty heavily into the transgender issues that has become this cycle, women's sports. And there were several ads, I think, that you saw Ted Cruz running, targeting Allred on that issue. Portraying a football player, a Colin Allred-sized football player in that ad. And you've also seen that happening down ballot a little bit, but that's the culture issue has been a big one for Ted Cruz.
Yeah, and in this battle over who is the most bipartisan candidate, we've seen them really lean into these cross-party endorsements, right? And that's sort of a phenomenon we've seen kind of trickle down ballot too. But can you talk a little bit about some of the major endorsements from across the aisle that the candidates have been touting?
Yeah, well, one of the big ones for Ted Cruz was Kim Ogg, the Democratic district attorney in Harris County, who with Democratic, with the main caveat that she was roundly defeated in her primary earlier this year, and has kind of been going to war with local Democrats like Lena Hidalgo in Houston. So I think that, but it does sort of fit into what the Cruz's message about sort of focusing on public safety, trying to tie that to the border, and just he's not necessarily pretending that Kim Ogg is the most liberal Democrat out there, but he is still sort of saying, look, public safety minded folks from both parties can work together. The big ones for Colin Allred, there's Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are kind of heading up this this coalition that doesn't have a ton of other star power. There's Glenn Whitley, the former Tarrant County Republican judge, who I believe he backed Dan Patrick in Dan Patrick's last re-election bid 2 years ago. So that one wasn't as big of a shocker, but it is part of what Allred's trying to do, which is appeal to the however many kind of Kinzinger, Liz Cheney supporting moderate conservatives are still out there.
I mean, we are seeing sort of this phenomenon happening up and down the ballot. We've seen some high-profile endorsements across the aisle for Trump, Liz Cheney being one of them, and then also down ballot. I mean, Renzo, you've written a little bit about how we're seeing this animate some of the legislative races. Can you talk a little bit about how that's playing out?
Yeah, so this past month, Steve Allison, a state representative from San Antonio, he succeeded Joe Strauss in that district, and kind of a more moderate district. And he was targeted by Governor Abbott during the primaries over his vote against education saving accounts, or school choice, or school vouchers, or whatever you want to call that issue. And in the past month, you've seen Steve Allison appear with the Democrat in that race, Laurel Jordan Swift, and he actually came out and endorsed her. I think that was the first time we saw that this cycle. And then over in Temple, Hugh Shine, he didn't fully endorse the Democrat in that race, but he did say if you're, Hugh Shine again being an ousted anti-voucher Republican, he was saying that, if you're a supporter of public schools, you need to vote for the Democrat in this race. And so the calculus there is that the Republicans are going to control the state house no matter what at the end of this election. But when it comes to school vouchers, school choice, the numbers are really close. So, if you support the Democrat on just this one issue, that could be enough to hold off on vouchers for a little while longer.
Yeah, and these are not like liberal conservatives. So
No, yeah, these are, well, I would say with Steve Allison, he's kind of served as more of a moderate. I think Hushain as well also has some issues where he splits with the party as well on, local control has been a big one. But by and large, they are, they're voting with Abbott every time, except on school vouchers.
I mean, I think it's also, school vouchers obviously rightfully get a lot of the attention, but I think some of the acrimony too is just the primary for the GOP this year was just an absolute, just a blood. It was
Insert descriptor here.
yeah. And I mean, and I do think that you have a lot of people who were ousted in that primary who are coming out very strong against the Tim Dunn wing of the party, a lot of this incoming class, and I think it will definitely be interesting come next session to see if they are able to get everyone back, get the gang back together and actually be able to, get all of their priorities done, because I think that there is a lot of remaining. And again, like a lot of these people are close friends. Like yeah, XYZ lawmaker may not be in the state house anymore, but his friends are, and they don't forget easily like what was said about their friends. I think it's going to be more difficult than I think a lot of people are letting on, but we'll see.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point about just moving into the legislative part of the conversation, there is not really a world where Democrats win enough seats in this November to take control. The numbers just aren't there because of redistricting and gerrymandering. But there are other things at stake, like school vouchers and just sort of like the makeup of the House, right? Which of Dade Phelan's allies, Speaker Dade Phelan's allies, get in, and if he has enough support in the House to maintain leadership, and then this just notion of like how far to the right that the House actually swings, which is something you've been writing like a lot about, Rob. But I'm just just when we're talking about like Steve Allison and Hushain and like they're Republicans, but like they're kind of moderate. It's like I think about like moderate Republicans like Lyle Larson from like a few years ago, who was always trying to support Medicaid expansion. It's just like it does feel like the definition of like what is a moderate has like kind of changed because of the makeup of the House, right?
I mean, I think it's the makeup of the House, but the makeup of the House is the product of a 10, 15-year campaign by a certain wing of the party to really just pull the party further and further right. And one of the main vehicles that they've done that, the way that they've done that up until this year was just if primarying people. They have again a handful of really, really, really wealthy donors who are more than happy to sink $200,000 into a primary challenge that ostensibly they didn't think that they could win, but it's going to drain your campaign coffers. It's going to bruise you up, and you're going to kind of, get into the next legislative session and think, when you think about whether or not you're going to vote against something that they want, like that is going to be in the back of your head. And that was the strategy for the longest time. And then this year we saw a massive flip in the fact that they started winning those races. I mean, I think Defend Texas Liberty, which is the Tim Dunn Ferris Wilkes PAC in 2022, I think they sank, I think they lost all but one of their races out of like 20. And then this year they won like 18 of, like they won a huge portion of the races that they were invested in. Obviously, some of that had to do with Abbott getting involved, Dan Patrick being involved, Paxton being involved in school vouchers and immigration as well. But there were some districts like Shellick Luther's district where they had rematches of 2022 and they saw, double-digit swings in their candidate's favor. Like she lost by, I think, like double digits in 2022 and then won, I think, by double digits this year. And it's really just a product of the way that kind of wing of the Texas GOP has successfully messaged this idea that, the Republicans in control. And I think that there was some truth to that in the Joe Strauss era. Like, he was governing over a very, very fragile coalition where they had a slim majority at a certain point, and I think did have to make some, made concessions to Democrats. I wouldn't say that, I don't think it's entirely wrong to just discard out of hand this idea that they're, the Texas legislature wasn't as Republican as the party itself, but in the recent years we've really seen that line, that rhetoric, get much more salient among the base, to the point where you have people like Glenn Rogers or Briscoe Kane being called rhinos, which is just news to a lot of people, I think.
I mean, I do think part of what's at stake with the November elections as far as the Texas legislature goes is just whether Republicans feel like there are any kind of consequences or there's any risk associated with nominating these candidates from the rightmost flank of the party, which, looking back in 2022, we've seen some very conservative sessions recently. There has been a trend of, that has continued this cycle, obviously, of in the primaries of the more moderate or mainstream Republicans going down. And, in 2022, there really weren't any consequences for that trend because, again, we're fresh out of a redistricting cycle. None of these House races were really all that competitive. But, if you think back to like 2018, for example, Matt Rinaldi, the former chair of the Texas Republican Party, former state rep, he, oh gosh, I might be getting the years wrong, but I know he defeated a more moderate Republican at one point, and then in that 2018 cycle, he lost his seat. So I think it goes to show that the later you get in the decade, the more risk there is for Republicans, as these districts get closer, of nominating folks who kind of align with the Rinaldi train of thought. But we haven't seen those consequences right now. And I think Steve Allison race is a great example of that, where Democrats would not be going after that district nearly as hard, if at all, if Steve Allison was the nominee, and now they see a flip opportunity.
Roughly, like, how many House seats do you think are at play? Are in play?
Several. I mean, it's I think kind of fluctuated throughout the cycle, and it sort of depends who you're asking. I mean, I think, and another thing to keep in mind too is that Republicans have a really good pickup opportunity in Tracy King's district, which goes from a Democrat who goes from his district goes from the border all the way up just south of San Antonio. It was a district drawn with the intent of electing a Republican. I think Trump maybe carried it by 4 points in 2020. So, even if, say, Democrats pick up 5 seats, maybe they're only netting 4. But I think, just kind of going up the I-35 corridor, there's Janie Lopez, in a Republican in South Texas, whose seat is in play. John Lujan in South San Antonio, along with Mark LaHood. And there are a couple in Dallas. There's Angie Chen Button and Morgan Meyer, two seats that Trump carried by less than a percentage point in 2020. So that, coupled with there are a few sort of, I think, more outside chance districts, like Renzo's done some coverage of Caroline Harris Davila's district up in Williamson County. So, several, but it sort of depends who you ask.
Yeah, Caroline Harris's district is pretty interesting because we actually have seen little signals of her moderating her message. Can you talk a little bit about that, Renzo? And what do you think that what does that mean?
Sure. Yeah. So Caroline Harris Davila, she's currently a freshman, and she's vying for her second term right now. Is up in Round Rock. And that's a district that is one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing district in Texas. And what you've seen in her race is, while a lot of Republicans like Ted Cruz are talking about transgender issues, she has kind of steered clear of that. She's kind of gone with the more meat and potatoes, like economy, safety, and also talking about families as well. But I think you haven't seen her talk about abortion like she may have on the 2020 campaign trail. There was some reporting that that issue came off her campaign website. I think that's more of just a reset for the new election cycle. But that's just kind of an example of what's going on in that district, where nationally you've seen abortion become a rallying cry for Democrats, and you've seen some more moderate Republicans also coming out in support of abortion measures at the ballot box. And I think that with her district, you're probably seeing just an example of what's going on at the suburbs in those growing districts right now.
And we've, just with campaign finance reports that dropped just hours ago this morning, we've seen some Republican groups really, especially Texans for Lawsuit Reform, really coming in strong to try to boost Caroline Harris at the end here, which suggests they're seeing polling that it could be in play, and that is one of the ones that looked a little bit more like an outside chance for Democrats to pick up at the beginning of the cycle. So it's interesting that there's so much attention on it in the closing days.
What did I saw something? What did Elon's giving look like?
Oh yeah, he's
Elon Musk. If you haven't heard
We're
of
on
him,
a first name basis.
okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you to clarify that.
he's like Cher.
Yeah, he's started. Of course, it has dumped a whole bunch of money into his pro-Trump PAC at the national level, but gotten a little bit less attention. He has started to play a role at the state level as well, and he most recently, about a month ago, gave a couple $1 million to a PAC that's supporting Republican Court of Appeals candidates in various like regional districts around the state. And before that, he had also given money to group I just mentioned, Texans for Lawsuit Reform, kind of one of the biggest tort reform groups that typically supports Republicans in the general election. So I think it'll just be interesting to see how much more involved he gets with state elections, and if Texas really is starting to look like it's in play, as it looks more and more like it could flip blue. If we get to that point, you could see Elon Musk coming in and being sort of a cash cow for Republicans. I think that's something to watch for.
I was surprised to see his interest in courts, and I'm going to use that as a little segue to talk about the judiciary. Interestingly enough, some of the most competitive races are on the Texas Supreme Court and the Court of Criminal Appeals, which are elections that don't typically get a lot of attention but have tremendous amount of power. And I'm sure that the reason why they don't get that much attention is because they've just been statically read. All of the seats of both of the high courts have been read for decades now. So, Rob, can you talk a little bit about what are the political dynamics that are animating those races and why those races feel competitive?
Yeah, I mean, on the Texas Supreme Court, there's really no question about it. It's abortion. I mean, and that is, there's a Dem PAC, the Find Out PAC, the second half, the first part of that equation being F around and find out. And basically, their kind of strategy has been what they call the Jimmy, John, and Jane strategy, going after Justices John Devine, Jimmy Blacklock, and Jane Bland, and really have just kind of made abortion the central issue. I think that there's, we've written pretty extensively about some ethical questions about Justice John Devine, who narrowly won his primary in March by, I think, less than half of a percentage point, which was really shocking for someone who's been on the court since 2012 and has a lot of base support. And I think, this PAC and Dems more broadly have really kind of, instead of focusing on, a basket of issues, have really just put almost entirely all their messaging onto, making those three the face of Texas's abortion policy, I think. And it'll be interesting to see if that plays out. I mean, I think, it is Texas. We haven't had a Dem Supreme Court justice in at least 3 decades, I believe. And in conversations with some Dems, I think there has been a little bit of a question about like, would it have been better to focus on singularly one person or go after all three? I mean, I think it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that they're even talking to some Republicans, they are definitely looking at the Trump margin, they're looking at the Cruz margin, and there are real concerns. I think that one of those seats could be in jeopardy, and I think particularly John Devine is the name that comes up a lot. And then on the Court of Criminal Appeals, you have, there were 3, part of the March bloodbath in the Texas GOP primary was there were 3 judges who were primaried and lost. A lot of that had to do with Ken Paxton's issue with them not letting him unilaterally prosecute voter fraud. That is something that has kind of really I've seen, kind of separate from the Court of Criminal Appeals, is something that we've seen kind of matriculate into the broader election fraud conspiracy theories. So I would be on the lookout for that at the post-election. This idea that Ken Paxton is banned from looking into voter fraud, which is a very simplistic way of looking at the actual issue, but I digress. The Court of Criminal Appeals, there are 3 seats on there, and I think that also we have suddenly seen a lot more renewed attention on them too in the wake of the Robertson, whole legal drama and political drama that is continuing to play out over his execution and trying to prevent his execution. So again, just in the past few weeks, we've seen that the Court of Criminal Appeals, which is ostensibly and normally a very anonymous but important part of our political system, really be thrust into the public spotlight. So,
there's a lot going on there, and I do think that like abortion is definitely animating, particularly on the Supreme Court elections. But you have done a lot of reporting on Justice John Devine in particular, and as you note, he was the only one who was primaried, and he just barely won his primary, which was like pretty stunning. So I think that there is like a sense that from Democrats that in addition to the votes on some of these high-profile abortion cases, he also has like some of these ethics issues. Could you sort of briefly talk a little bit about some of these ethics issues that you've been reporting on?
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the centerpiece of his primary opponent's campaign too. In the Republican primary, was focusing. He had missed more than half of oral arguments before the court last year while he campaigned. He auctioned off tours of his chambers for a Texas GOP GOP fundraiser. And then we've reported, pretty extensively, and beginning in February and continuing through last week, there was an issue. We wrote about him not recusing from a very high-profile sex abuse lawsuit involving a Southern Baptist leader, Paul Pressler, in Houston, and Pressler's longtime law partner, Jared Woodfill. Devine worked at the firm at the time that the plaintiff in the case alleged that he was abused, but did not recuse himself when the case was before the court. And then last week we wrote about another thing about he is currently overseeing the trust of an elderly woman. There are prohibitions in the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct on just judges overseeing trusts of non-family members for a variety of reasons, including, you don't want to judge being able to, they vote on things that could affect trust law, the oil and gas royalties contained in this trust. And then there's, of course, just the broader question of the appearance of impropriety, which is something the Code of Conduct explicitly says judges must avoid. And the question of, if you are in a lower level court dispute and on the other side of the aisle is a sitting Texas Supreme Court justice, can you truly believe that they are not getting deferential treatment? And so he's been in control of this trust for about 2 years. We talked to a bunch of legal ethics experts about it who said that, it was a pretty clear violation of the Code of Conduct. He, however, has maintained that it's not, because he and the woman were like family, that she considered him a son, which I think, that there is. We did some extensive reporting on them having a close relationship for a long time. That woman's friends, some of her friends, and her niece said that there was a bit of a falling out a few years ago. But it remains to be seen. We've also written about we got leaked audio in February of him talking about the other justices on the court, calling them brainwashed by big law and saying that they cared more about legal processes like standing and timeliness than their fidelity to the Constitution. And then in 2023, he, which we also reported about in March, he gave a speech where he talked about how Democrats were basically saying that he was like believed without question that they were going to try to steal the 2024 election, which was not taken too kindly by particularly the Harris County Elections Administration Office that he singled out, given that they have frequently had election-related lawsuits in front of the Texas Supreme Court. So
Google Rob Downen and John Devine.
Yeah.
For more on that. Let's take some questions.
Great. Reminder for our online audience, you can ask questions at texastribune.org/ask. First question here, then we'll get to some from our in-person audience. So it's fair to say that many in Texas and across the country are ready for the 2024 election to be over and would love to have answers Tuesday night. With what may be a contested presidential election, may it take longer to know some results of state elections? How should we prepare ourselves, and how does a newsroom prepare for what may be a longer process?
I don't think it's unlikely that it would turn into kind of the multi-day affair that we've grown used to seeing at the presidential level. I mean, I think the biggest source of delay typically is, especially Harris County has sort of a proclivity to, in some recent elections they have actually, we've gotten full returns. I don't know, maybe around like 4 a.m. In the past I remember covering a mayoral election where the full results didn't come until like 9 a.m. the next morning or something. So I think, we in a razor thin scenario where, say the Senate race comes down to a matter of a few thousand votes or something like that, that absolutely that probably would turn into a multi-day affair because you're waiting on all the large counties to fully report their results, and then you've got overseas ballots coming in, and then you have to wait for they don't officially canvass the results for a couple weeks. So I think, but aside from that, if unless it's like really, really on the margins, we're probably going to know pretty much everything that happens on election night, with maybe some scattered exceptions in really close district races.
That said, I do think that there's going to be, depending on how a lot of those races shake out. I mean, we're already kind of seeing a lot of messaging around broader election fraud, almost preemptively, it seems. So I would fully expect that there's going to be a lot of backlash depending on how some of those races shake out.
A protracted fight, at least.
A protracted fight, the most journalistic, yeah.
My name is Sparkle Williams. How effective are the anti-transgender ads with the general electorate? And second, should we anticipate more of the same in 2026?
I think for the second question, I think some of that will, of course, depend on how this race plays out and how effective they turn out to be for Cruz. I mean, I think this, going back to 2022, I believe, I don't think the anti-transgender ads were quite the same pitch or the same volume, but there was still a similar round of kind of multiple candidates across multiple states floating these ads. And from my understanding is that it turned out to not be super effective. I mean, just thinking nationally, there was all this talk about a red wave that sort of didn't come to pass. So I think, but that said, I think the Cruz folks and their allies clearly, see something in the polling that this does resonate with sort of folks on the fence, especially the kind of the moderates who Allred has spent his entire campaign targeting. I think that's who they're really directing these ads at, in addition to sort of firing up the base. It sort of serves a dual purpose for them. So I think that's why we're seeing it, but we're just going to have to wait till November 5th to see how effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has potential to go the same way as the the CRT, some of the messaging we saw around 2020 with groups like Moms for Liberty that really helped bring about a wave for more local races across the country, but are starting to, I think, the staying power of that message, I think, is starting to come into question, particularly as those groups have had a chance to actually govern, and people have seen, especially with stuff like local school boards, people, don't pay attention to them until they do, and all of a sudden, I think we're starting to see kind of a backlash to the backlash, I guess.
Yeah, and this isn't the first year that transgender issues have been on top of mind for some candidates. But I think what you've seen this year that you hadn't seen previously is that some of the Democrats are starting to respond. You saw Colin Allred cut an ad on the issue. You saw Sherrod Brown in Ohio. And you also saw Vicente Gonzalez down in South Texas do an ad on the issue. And so, that suggests that maybe they are seeing that it could be swaying voters, or maybe they're, just trying to anticipate whether it could. But I don't think we'll know until Election Day whether that really swayed anybody.
It does feel more top of mind, and it does feel like more strategic. I mean, I obviously LGBTQ issues have been a part of many election cycles, but the investment and the as you noted, the Ted Cruz ad. Could you describe the ad in case you guys haven't seen this one, where it insinuated that he was hitting a.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of like a. I think Renzo described it aptly, sort of a Colin Allred-sized football player, sort of trying to leave the image in someone's mind, of a viewer's mind, of Colin Allred himself tackling this sort of helpless young girl who's playing elementary school sports, which is the Democrats obviously would rebut that, saying it's ridiculous and not what's going on. But it's, I know, I've certainly heard from Republicans who saw that ad and thought it would be very effective. It's that they.
I just think it's an interesting question. I'm sorry, I know we have other questions, but I just thought it was a very interesting moment in the election. And I thought that Colin Allred's response to it, where he said, of course I don't support, men, boys playing girls sports, but he didn't really emphatically support trans rights. I just thought that was interesting, and I'm curious too, how this plays out and what the response to this is, because it feels like they're activating on something.
Well, but I do think that there's a question. You at what point are you just pissing off a lot of really young Gen Z voters who are already pissed off about abortion and are much more progressive on LGBTQ plus issues? I think that there is a real risk of continuing with that message long term. It activates the base, but it also activates another base.
So we have 3 more questions coming, and what we'll do so that we can make sure we get done in time here is we might have one panelist who can answer each of these questions. Thank you.
Yes, State Representative James Tallarico has been very effective pushing against bringing Christian nationalism into the classrooms. Do you see any impact for his actions, for his words, on the election in Texas?
I think, I can't speak directly to Representative Tallarico, but I think that there has been a much more concerted effort, specifically in Texas, to push back against Christian nationalism. You have Christians Against Christian Nationalism, of which I believe Representative Tallarico is a member, that's based, I think, in the Dallas area. But we are starting to see, again, I think, in the same vein that we are starting to see more and more backlash to Republican messaging on the LGBTQ community and abortion, there is a growing wave of people who are starting to understand the linkages between, the anti-LGBTQ messaging, anti-abortion policy, and Christian nationalism more broadly. And I think that again does really run the risk, if you look at demographically the broader secularization of the country and a move away from white evangelicalism in particular. I do think in the long run, does have the potential to be a part of this broader backlash to the Republican Party. That said, there was just polling that came out yesterday that showed that Trump, I think, has gained amongst every single religious group, including atheists and what we call the nuns in the religion world, which is people who are, kind of. I won't get into it, but I mean I do think that he has gained some ground in a lot of religious groups, so it'll be interesting to see.
Thank you. In 2018, O'Rourke traveled the state, but he basically ran a big city-based campaign. Harris has picked up on the idea of holding down the Republican margins in Republican areas. She talked about it a lot in North Carolina, and I'm wondering if you're seeing any signs of that from Allred and the Democrats here in Texas.
I guess, I think he definitely has been decidedly focusing on the cities. I think there has been an increasing train of thought, especially after the 2022 cycle among Texas Democrats, when O'Rourke was on the ballot, did a lot of the barnstorming of sort of middle of nowhere places that consistently vote Republican, and he didn't really make much of a dent there. So I think there has been quite a bit more pessimism among Texas Democrats about just how worth it is to kind of contest with the sort of Fox News, whatever bubble that the voters in those rural areas are, how they're consuming their information is just so hard to break through in those areas. So I think, in as much as we've seen an effort from Allred to sort of limit the damage in those areas, I think that's just borne out in his moderate message and just sort of trying to come off as a centrist who would work across the aisle. But we haven't really seen him, of course, go into Muleshoe or wherever to the same level that O'Rourke was.
Has he talked about guns at all?
Because
I like the Beto thing. Like I think he was cooked in
I would
rural
be
parts of the
hard-pressed
state.
to recall a time that either Senate candidate has talked about guns on the trail this cycle. Yeah.
So about 4 years ago and 8 years ago, there was this app or website that people would rely on for this type of information, and then the new owner apparently alienated a lot of his customers and his advertisers. So how has that changed this cycle for you guys?
Sorry, what was the name of that website?
Depending, yeah. I mean, I guess how has Twitter, the Everything X app, affected the news, the election? I mean, I think I wouldn't say there's a lack of it. I think that it's just drastically changed. Granted, it could just be that I spend all day in some dark corners of the internet as part of my job, but I think that app has become a stream of disinformation and hate, the normalization of just like some of the most putrid misogyny, transphobia, and straight up Nazism. Like that app has become just a vehicle for radicalizing people. And I think that people who are on it understand that, but a lot of people who are not on it do not understand that, and it is very scary, and we should be taking it much more seriously, especially when you have reports coming out just last week that Elon is meeting on a semi-regular basis with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, it feels like candidates are kind of going through the motions on Twitter, doing what they need to do to maintain appearances and show signs of life for their campaign, just sort of posting shots from rallies and just showing signs of life there. But it's they're clearly engaging through different mediums. That's like way down the list for having much. I think the way that it's playing out in this election is it's much more significant, kind of the radicalization that Rob was just talking about.
Yeah, I mean it is yanking the Overton window to some very concerning places, and forcing, I think, campaigns getting back to the election ties. I mean, forcing them to tailor their messages a little bit more to not only, rather than tailor messages to go viral, tailor messages to avoid being on the receiving end of a swarm of people who paid $8 to call you all sorts of insults and the most horrific things you'll ever read on the internet. So,
All the kids are on TikTok anyway. Thank you so much.
which is not any better.
We really appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming, and join us again in a week when, after the election results, when we have another panel of political reporters here to tell us what we got wrong. Thank you.